December 18th, 1972, 30 miles northwest of Hanoi, North Vietnam. Major Robert Certain, pilot of an F-111A Aardvark, flew his aircraft at exactly 200 feet above the jungle canopy at 600 miles per hour. It was 2 in the morning, total darkness. Heavy monsoon clouds obscured any moonlight. Visibility, 0. And yet, Major Certain's hands rested lightly on the controls, not flying the aircraft at all. The terrain-following radar was flying for him. The F-111's autopilot responded to terrain data streaming from the AN/APQ-110 radar, automatically commanding pitch and roll inputs to maintain precise altitude above the rapidly changing ground below. Hills approaching. The nose pitched up smoothly. Valley ahead. The nose dropped, all automatic, all precise. Major Certain monitored the instruments, his finger resting near the override button, but the system performed flawlessly. His weapons systems officer, Captain James Turner, called out the countdown to the target. 30 seconds. The Hanoi rail yards appeared on their navigation display, exactly where the inertial navigation system predicted. They had programmed the target coordinates before takeoff. The system guided them perfectly through 150 miles of hostile airspace. At 20 seconds, the weapons bay doors opened. At 10 seconds, Captain Turner armed the ordnance. At release point, 6,000 pounds of precision-guided munitions dropped from the internal bay. The F-111 jinked left, still at 200 feet, still at 600 miles per hour, and disappeared back into the darkness. On the ground, North Vietnamese air defense crews scrambled to their stations. Radar operators searched their scopes frantically. Nothing. The SA-2 guideline missile operators checked their systems. No targets. The engagement had lasted 15 seconds. The American strike aircraft had penetrated their airspace, delivered ordnance on target, and departed before anyone could react. One North Vietnamese air defense officer would later describe the experience in captured documents. Ghost aircraft struck from the darkness, below our radar coverage. We heard the explosions. We never saw them coming. This was the F-111 Aardvark, the aircraft North Vietnam never expected. The aircraft that changed low-level strike operations forever. By December 1972, North Vietnam had built the most sophisticated air defense network outside the Soviet Union itself. The experience of Operation Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968 and Operation Linebacker the Fawn earlier in 1972 had taught North Vietnamese forces exactly how to counter American air power. They had studied every tactic, learned from every engagement, and refined their defensive systems to near perfection. The foundation of North Vietnamese air defense doctrine centered on altitude bands. High-altitude threats, primarily B-52 Stratofortress operations and F-4 Phantom fighter bomber strikes, faced the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile system. The Soviet-supplied SA-2s had proven devastatingly effective against aircraft operating above 3,000 feet. With a maximum engagement altitude exceeding 60,000 feet and a range of 25 miles, the SA-2 forced American aircraft into dangerous compromises between altitude, speed, and exposure time. Medium-altitude threats fell into the engagement envelope of the ZSU-23-4, Shilka radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery system. These mobile platforms combined 4 23mm autocannons with integrated radar fire control, creating an effective altitude band from 1,000 to 5,000 feet. The Shilka could track aircraft in poor weather and engage them with devastating accuracy. American pilots called them hell from below, and with good reason. Below 1,000 feet, North Vietnamese air defense planners relied on a simple assumption. Aircraft could not operate safely at such low altitudes, especially at night or in poor weather. The terrain of North Vietnam included mountains, hills, valleys, and numerous obstacles. Flying below 1,000 feet required constant visual reference to avoid terrain collision. At night or in weather, this became impossible. Therefore, North Vietnamese doctrine concluded, low-altitude operations posed unacceptable risk to attacking aircraft. They would fly high, or they would crash. This doctrine appeared validated by years of operational experience. No American aircraft regularly operated below 1,000 feet at night. The occasional low-level daylight strike occurred, typically conducted by specialized units accepting extraordinary risk, but these remained exceptions. The standard approach involved medium to high-altitude penetration, accepting the SA-2 threat as manageable through electronic countermeasures, evasive maneuvering, and wild weasel suppression missions. North Vietnamese air defense commanders felt confident in their assessment. They controlled the altitude above 3,000 feet with SA-2 missiles. They controlled the medium altitude with Shilkas and conventional anti-aircraft artillery. And they controlled the low altitude through simple physics and geography. American aircraft had nowhere to hide. They were about to discover they were wrong. The General Dynamics F-111 represented a revolutionary approach to tactical strike aircraft design. Development began in the early 1960s under the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, intended to create a single aircraft capable of serving both Air Force and Navy requirements. The Navy eventually abandoned the program, but the Air Force persisted, recognizing the F-111's unique capabilities. The most distinctive feature was the variable geometry wing design. The wings could sweep from 16 degrees for maximum lift during takeoff and landing to 72.5 degrees for high-speed flight and low-altitude penetration. This provided performance across the entire speed envelope, from slow approach speeds to Mach 2.5 at altitude. The wings swept back. The F-111 became a high-speed dart. The wings swept forward. It gained the efficiency needed for long-range operations. The cockpit configuration broke with fighter tradition. Instead of tandem seating, the pilot and weapons systems officer sat side by side. This arrangement facilitated crew coordination during complex low-level navigation and weapons delivery. More importantly, it enabled a unique safety feature, the escape capsule. Rather than ejection seats, the entire cockpit section could separate from the aircraft, descend by parachute, and provide flotation in water landings. This system offered survival capability across a much wider range of emergency conditions than conventional ejection seats. But the F-111's true revolution resided in its terrain-following radar system. The AN/APQ-110 terrain-following radar, later upgraded to the AN/APQ-146, represented the most advanced automatic flight control system deployed in any aircraft. The radar continuously scanned the terrain ahead of the aircraft, computing ground elevation across the flight path. The system then calculated the required pitch and roll commands to maintain a preset altitude above the terrain, typically set between 200 and 1,000 feet, depending on mission requirements and risk tolerance. This wasn't simple radar altimetry. The system looked forward, anticipating terrain changes before the aircraft reached them. Hills ahead. The autopilot commanded a climb. Valley approaching. The autopilot initiated a descent. The changes occurred smoothly, automatically, without pilot input. The pilot monitored the system, ready to override if necessary. But during normal operations, the terrain-following radar flew the aircraft more precisely than any human could at such extreme low altitude and high speed. The implications were profound. Terrain-following radar enabled all-weather, day-night operations at altitudes where visual flight became impossible. An F-111 could penetrate hostile airspace at 200 feet altitude, 600 miles per hour, in total darkness or solid cloud cover, following terrain contours automatically while the crew focused on navigation and weapons delivery. No other aircraft in the world possessed this capability in 1972. The navigation system matched the sophistication of the terrain-following radar. An inertial navigation system provided continuous position updates without external reference. Before flight, crews programmed waypoints and target coordinates. During flight, the INS guided the aircraft along the planned route, displaying position, bearing, and time to next waypoint on cockpit displays. Combined with the terrain-following radar, this enabled precision navigation through hostile airspace without radar emissions that enemy forces could detect. The weapon's payload complemented the penetration capability. The F-111 could carry 31,500 pounds of ordnance, distributed between an internal weapons bay and external pylons. The internal bay enabled weapons carriage without external drag or radar signature, maintaining the aircraft's performance during penetration. The F-111 could deliver conventional iron ordnance, precision-guided munitions including paveway laser-guided weapons, and later, tactical nuclear weapons. This flexibility allowed mission planners to match payload to target requirements. Performance specifications demonstrated the aircraft's capability. Maximum speed exceeded Mach 2.5 at altitude. Low-level speed reached 600 miles per hour sustained. Combat radius approached 1,500 miles with internal fuel, extendable through aerial refueling. This combination of speed, range, and payload exceeded any contemporary strike aircraft. The F-111's first combat deployment occurred in March 1968 under the codename Combat Lancer. 6 F-111As deployed to Thailand, conducting missions against North Vietnamese targets. The deployment encountered immediate problems. 3 aircraft were lost within the first 2 weeks, 2 to operational accidents and 1 to unknown causes. The program was suspended. The aircraft returned to the United States for modifications. These early losses resulted from mechanical issues rather than fundamental design flaws. Hydraulic system problems, horizontal stabilizer failures, and other technical defects required correction. The Air Force implemented fixes, modified procedures, and prepared for eventual return to combat operations. The F-111 had demonstrated its potential, but required refinement before becoming fully operational. By late 1972, those refinements were complete. Operation Linebacker 2 commenced on December 18, 1972. The objective: force North Vietnam to negotiate seriously at the Paris peace talks through sustained aerial operations against military and industrial targets throughout North Vietnam, particularly in the heavily defended Hanoi Haiphong area. The operation would employ every available strike asset, including B-52 Stratofortress operations against high-value strategic targets. The F-111 force had returned to Southeast Asia in September 1972, assigned to the 429th and 430th Tactical Fighter Squadrons, operating from Tak Lee Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. These units brought combat-ready F-111As equipped with upgraded terrain-following radar, modified weapons systems, and experienced crews trained in low-level penetration tactics. They were ready to demonstrate the capabilities that made the F-111 unique. The tactical advantage became immediately apparent. While B-52 operations required relatively clear weather for precision bombing and self-defense, F-111s operated in any conditions: monsoon weather, solid cloud cover, total darkness. The conditions that grounded other aircraft became the F-111's tactical advantage. North Vietnamese forces learned to relax their air defense posture during bad weather, assuming no strikes would occur. F-111s exploited this assumption repeatedly. On the first night of Linebacker 2, December 18th, multiple F-111 flights penetrated North Vietnamese airspace, while B-52s conducted high-altitude strikes. The mission profile was simple, but devastating. Ingress at 200 feet altitude, maintaining terrain-following radar guidance. Navigate to target using inertial navigation system. Deliver ordnance with precision. Egress at 200 feet, still automatic, still below enemy radar coverage. Major Surten's mission that night typified F-111 operations. His target, the Hanoi rail yards, sat in the heart of North Vietnam's air defense network. SA-2 sites ringed the city. Radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery covered every approach. MiG fighters stood alert at nearby airfields. It was the most heavily defended target in Southeast Asia outside of Moscow itself. The F-111 approached from the northwest, using terrain masking to avoid early warning radar. The terrain-following radar maintained 200 feet above ground level automatically. Speed, 600 miles per hour. Time from border crossing to target, 12 minutes. Time exposed to enemy defenses over the target, 15 seconds. The SA-2 sites tracked nothing. Their radar systems couldn't reliably detect targets below 1,500 feet, especially at such high speed. Ground clutter masked the radar returns. The F-111's low altitude placed it well below the SA-2's minimum engagement envelope anyway. The missiles sat useless, their operators staring at empty scopes. The ZSU-23-4 Shilkas faced similar problems. Their radar systems struggled with low-altitude, high-speed targets under the best conditions. In darkness, with no visual acquisition possible, they couldn't engage effectively. Some crews fired barrage patterns at suspected ingress routes, hoping to hit something through sheer volume of fire. They hit nothing. Manual anti-aircraft artillery offered no better solution. The gunners couldn't see the target. They couldn't hear the approach over their own radar equipment and communication systems. By the time they heard the jet noise, the F-111 had already passed, delivered its ordnance, and begun egress. Firing at the sound meant shooting at empty sky. The ordnance struck precisely on target. Secondary explosions indicated successful hits on rolling stock and storage facilities. The F-111 was already 10 miles away before the first air defense response began. Major Surton's mission represented one of dozens conducted that night, and hundreds conducted throughout Linebacker 2. The F-111 force maintained constant pressure on North Vietnamese logistics, command and control, and air defense systems. Weather didn't matter. Darkness didn't matter. The terrain following radar enabled operations that were simply impossible for any other aircraft. Over the course of the Vietnam War, F-111s conducted more than 4,000 combat sorties. 6 F-111s were lost in combat, representing a loss rate of 0.15%. This was the lowest loss rate of any strike aircraft operating in Vietnam. 3 losses occurred due to ground fire, typically during egress when the aircraft climbed above 1,000 feet. 3 occurred due to operational accidents unrelated to enemy action. By comparison, F-4 Phantoms suffered significantly higher loss rates despite operating in similar threat environments. F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the primary strike aircraft earlier in the war, experienced devastating losses. The B-52 force lost 15 aircraft during Linebacker 2 alone, though most of these occurred during high-altitude operations where SA-2 missiles proved effective. The pilots who flew F-111 missions described experiences unlike any other aircraft. Captain William Dallecky, an F-111 weapons systems officer, recorded his impressions after a Linebacker 2 mission. Flying at 200 feet, 600 miles per hour, watching the terrain following radar display, the trust in technology had to be absolute. We couldn't see anything outside. Total darkness. Heavy weather. The radar showed terrain rising ahead. The nose came up automatically, and we climbed over hills we never saw. North Vietnamese never saw us coming. We were ghosts in their airspace. The weather operations capability proved particularly valuable. During the monsoon season, F-111s conducted missions while F-4s, A-7s and other tactical aircraft remained grounded. This maintained continuous pressure on North Vietnamese logistics networks, preventing them from using weather as operational sanctuary. Supply convoys that moved only during bad weather, assuming safety from air operations, discovered F-111s could find them anyway. Target flexibility demonstrated another advantage. F-111s engaged bridges, rail yards, supply depots, petroleum storage facilities, command centers, and even SA-2 sites themselves. The precision delivery capability enabled engagement of targets previously considered too difficult or too risky for conventional strike aircraft. A bridge pier, a specific building in an urban complex, a particular section of rail line. The F-111 could hit it, at night, in weather, from 200 feet altitude. North Vietnamese forces attempted various countermeasures. Intelligence analysis identified suspected F-111 ingress routes and established barrage anti-aircraft artillery fire patterns. Crews would fire continuous volleys along these routes during mission windows, hoping to create a wall of fire the F-111s had to penetrate. This proved ineffective. The F-111s simply varied their routes, used terrain masking, or accepted the minimal risk from unguided barrage fire. Other attempts involved positioning radar-guided artillery systems in valleys and along suspected low-level routes. This assumed F-111s would follow predictable terrain corridors. The assumption was incorrect. The terrain-following radar enabled flight over any terrain, following any route. There were no predictable corridors, no standard approaches. Every mission could use a unique flight path. The fundamental problem facing North Vietnamese air defenses was simple. Their entire system was designed and optimized for high-altitude threats. The SA-2 missiles, the radar-guided artillery, the early warning radar networks, the MiG interceptor tactics. Everything assumed targets at medium to high altitude. When an aircraft appeared at 200 feet, traveling at 600 miles per hour, in darkness or weather, the system had no effective response. The altitude limitation of the SA-2 represented the most critical vulnerability. The missile's minimum engagement altitude exceeded 1,500 feet under optimal conditions, and often performed poorly below 3,000 feet due to ground clutter and radar tracking difficulties. An aircraft at 200 feet sat completely outside the SA-2's engagement envelope. The most effective weapon in the North Vietnamese arsenal couldn't touch the F-111. Radar coverage provided another insurmountable obstacle. Early warning radar systems struggled to detect and track low-altitude targets. Ground clutter from terrain, buildings, and vegetation masked returns from aircraft flying at extremely low altitude. The radar operators saw noise on their scopes, not clear target tracks. Without reliable detection and tracking, effective engagement became impossible. Manual anti-aircraft artillery faced the basic problem of target acquisition. Gunners couldn't see the aircraft in darkness, couldn't hear the approach in time to react, couldn't predict the flight path without radar guidance. Some crews reported hearing jet noise and seeing brief glimpses of afterburner flames, but by the time they oriented their weapons, the target had already departed the area. 15 seconds wasn't enough time to acquire, track, and engage a high-speed, low-altitude target. The speed factor compounded every other problem. At 600 miles per hour, the F-111 traveled 10 miles per minute, or 176 yards per second. Even if detection occurred, even if weapons systems locked on, even if engagement commenced, the target exposure time measured in single-digit seconds. By the time missiles launched or guns fired, the F-111 had already moved beyond the effective engagement zone. The weather advantage completed the tactical picture. North Vietnamese forces learned through painful experience that bad weather usually meant no air operations. B-52s required relatively clear conditions. Tactical fighters needed visual reference for target identification and weapons delivery. When monsoon storms rolled through, when clouds dropped to 500 feet, when visibility decreased to near zero, the air defense network relaxed. Alert status dropped. Crews stood down. This became routine procedure. F-111s operated in exactly these conditions. They launched during monsoons. They penetrated in solid cloud cover. They delivered ordnance in conditions where visual flight was impossible. The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate operational results. The F-111 proved that terrain-following radar technology could enable an entirely new category of strike operations. Low-level, all-weather, day-night precision strike became viable. This represented a fundamental shift in tactical aviation doctrine. Aircraft no longer needed to choose between high-altitude vulnerability to surface-to-air missiles or weather-dependent low-level operations. Technology enabled a third option: automatic low-level flight in any conditions. The F-111 remained in operational service with the United States Air Force until 1996, a 28-year operational lifetime. The F-111F variant, introduced in the 1970s with upgraded avionics and weapons systems, proved particularly effective during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. F-111Fs conducted precision strikes against Iraqi targets using paveway laser-guided weapons, demonstrating that the low-level penetration capability remained valuable decades after Vietnam. The technology developed for the F-111 transferred to subsequent aircraft. The B-1B Lancer incorporated advanced terrain-following radar derived from F-111 systems, enabling similar low-level penetration capability in a strategic platform. The F-15E Strike Eagle, while using different specific systems, employed the same fundamental concept: automatic terrain following for low-altitude operations in adverse conditions. Modern strike aircraft routinely include terrain-following radar as standard equipment, a capability that traces its combat origins to the F-111 in Vietnam. The doctrine influence proved equally significant. Modern strike planning incorporates low-level approaches as standard tactics. Precision weapons delivery from low altitude in weather conditions became routine rather than exceptional. Air defense systems evolved to address the low-altitude threat, developing shorter-range missiles and improving radar performance against ground clutter. The F-111 forced this evolution by demonstrating that altitude-only defensive strategies were insufficient. For North Vietnamese forces, the F-111 provided a painful lesson. An air defense network optimized for high-altitude threats remained vulnerable to low-altitude penetration. Technological innovation could invalidate carefully planned defensive systems. And perhaps most importantly, assumptions about what aircraft could or couldn't do needed constant re-evaluation based on enemy capability rather than theoretical limitations. December 18, 1972. Major Robert Surton pulled his F-111A off the target, still at 200 feet, still at 600 miles per hour, terrain-following radar guiding him automatically through the darkness. Behind him, secondary explosions lit the night sky over Hanoi. Around him, SA-2 sites sat silent, their operators still searching empty radar scopes. Below him, anti-aircraft gun crews fired at sounds and shadows, hitting nothing. The North Vietnamese air defense network controlled the airspace above 3,000 feet. They had spent years perfecting their systems, learning their craft, becoming experts at countering high-altitude threats. They built one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world. But America flew at 200 feet, and North Vietnam never saw them coming.